Good morning, good afternoon.
Good morning. Are we recording right away?
Yes,
Gotcha. I'll
but
put
it
away.
doesn't matter. We can edit stuff out and we can start
Okay.
over. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, because I'm not quite.
Oh,
I'm running slightly late, so I'm gonna get my Hitler haircut organized there, and yeah,
you can do a little bit more if you want. I was doing that a little bit earlier. I was
exactly right.
actually,
That's before I was on, and I'm finishing my cereal, so I think it's gonna be a chill little intro here.
yeah, cool. So let's speak to the audience real quick. Shalom and I have had a couple episodes, one podcast on his, one on mine, and on the one where I was asking him questions about what I was focused on was you, some of your past. I mean, in my head was just Judaism, religious stuff, not political things. But that did come up. So now I want to ask you a lot of questions about what you said, anti-Zionism. So first, what is Zionism? You did define that a little bit before, but of course, I'm guessing you'll be doing a lot more now.
Yeah.
And then what it means to be anti-Zionist, especially as a you're a Jew. You used to live in Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I remember you saying, and I could be mixing this up with other ideas I've been hearing from other people, you refuse to live in Israel now.
Yeah. Largely avoid it for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a good intro. So what do you want to tell us today?
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for having me back on, and I can give a bit of context. And yeah. By the way, timing wise, do you have more than an hour? You have an hour? Like, what are we looking at here?
I can't do more than 2 hours. My body tells me I have to stop.
2 hours. 2 hours is a long time. I think we'll do
Okay.
less than that. So
Yeah, good.
good to not have to be limited to an hour necessarily. Okay. So a bit of background in case people didn't hear that episode. As you said, I was born in Israel to North American parents, and how that phenomenon happens is we'll maybe talk more about that later. And specifically, I was born in the old city of Jerusalem, which is technically by most international definitions occupied Palestine. According to the UN, it is one of the most agreed upon places that should not belong to just the Jews. At the same time, and this kind of is like a microcosm, I was in the Jewish quarter, which has had a Jewish presence in it for 120 years, right? So there's an interesting kind of expression there. My father, interestingly, was devoutly religious and actually devoted himself to, in the last 20 years, to making films that are anti-Muslim and pro-Jewish, pro-Israel, both grouped into one. And so that's kind of like a big part of the environment that I was raised in. And I left Judaism 8-9 years ago, and that's the story from last podcast. And so I've been deconstructing Judaism. Deconstructing Zionism has been an ongoing, deeper journey because, as we'll talk, it actually runs even deeper in Jewish culture. I say it like this: you could be an atheist. We'll talk about the why, but you could be an atheist in Jewish culture, and it's quite accepted. Like, yeah, there's a whole sects of Judaism that are just atheists, but if you're anti-Zionist, that is like the biggest no-no in Jewish culture. It's more important and more of a baseline bedrock of the identity than even belief in God or
At least
religion.
the way it is today. Who knows what it was?
Exactly. No,
200
I'll
years
tell you
ago.
what it was. It was not
Yeah.
that, but we'll talk
Yeah.
about how that evolved. But that's how it is currently, and as a result, you don't even question it. It is even more basic, like Santa Claus. Of course, Santa Claus exists as a phenomenon than it is. So just personally, I actually grew up. I was an ordained rabbi myself. I served in the Israeli military as a social worker, specifically actually in the Kfir Brigade, which was created entirely to basically secure the Palestinian territories, what they call the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. That was so. You think of the Israeli military, at least on paper, it's supposedly to protect the borders, right? Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon. But there is an entire Israeli unit that was created just for the Palestinians. Okay, so that's another interesting anecdote there. I have a master's in sociology. And like I said, it's been an ongoing journey of of letting go. And actually, I will confess, I'm still very much in that journey, constantly learning new things. So what I say today might continue to evolve. I'm very open to learning, while also trying to figure out what sources to even look at, because so much of what I was raised with is not a valid source. And yeah, it really is unfolding live. So thank you again for having me on. And I believe the first place to start is actually like ancient history. That's almost always where you got to go. So that's where I'm going to go first. Yeah.
Okay, sure. I thought maybe we'll start 200 years ago or something, but you want to go older. Okay, that's cool.
2000. How about I see her 200 and I raise it 2000. Okay.
Okay.
Because it really has to go that far. And part of the reason is because one of the biggest Jewish claims for Israel today is two reasons I would go that far back is one, Jewish claims to today involve claiming that they are the indigenous people of the land of Israel. That's a big fundamental tenet to justify Zionism. And then the other flip side is that there's some fascinating Palestinians between the Palestinian experience today and the Jewish or Judean experience in Israel 2,000 years ago in other colonial hands. So I find that parallels fascinating. So to start out, I would say there is, according to most historians, no Exodus story. The Jews, the ancient Judeans living in Israel, did not come from Egypt as the Bible relates to it. Rather, they were an indigenous people to the land that was called Canaan at the time. And they sort of morphed, and they started out as tribes. It was very tribal. That was like early humanity did not have big empires necessarily to begin with. So it started out as tribes, and you actually see this kind of tribal phenomenons in fairly recent, Arabic, Middle Eastern culture, right? You got a small group of people. They run themselves in some sort of independent body. They've got like a leader, but who's very local, and that's who they follow. And so they started out as that, and over time they started unifying more and more, and that became kingdoms. And in the Bible, which is not a historic document, you can still follow the trends of this evolution, where early Israel or early Judean peoples were governed by they called them judges. Okay, so this was a person who mostly was there to kind of resolve disputes. That was like the highest level that you really needed. You needed somebody who kind of maybe told you some of the words of God. He would fight some battles, and then he would resolve disputes. That was the level of it. And there's the evolution to when the people of Israel, according to the Bible, wanted a king. They wanted that level of monarchy type of rule, which I would assume would be even more authoritarian, but would mirror other cultures maybe around them. And there's a lot of pushback. The prophet who's supposed to be picking the king is like, why would you need this? Isn't it enough to just have a judge and have the direct word of God? Why do you have to be like all the other people? So it's fascinating that there was actually, like, the Bible was not ready to move on to that stage, or had to at least explain it. And the Jews were not the only people living in Israel at the time. They were one of the bigger peoples, and I refer to them as Jews because it's easiest, but they were actually not yet the Jews that we know today. They were Judeans. They were themselves divided into different subgroups, the northern Israelites, the southern Judeans, for example.
These are separate tribes is the point. All sort of intermingled in the same area. They work with each other a little bit, and sometimes I'm guessing they see themselves as one, but they are also technically different tribes, clans, family groups, whatever.
Yeah, it might have been bigger than that. There was, so the King David, the famous King David, there is historical evidence that he existed. But interestingly enough, as far as we can tell, he only ruled Judea, which was in the south, which is now kind of like from Jerusalem downwards to the desert. So the whole northern, greener part of Israel had separate governance. And in fact, this again is historical. There were different, during those periods, there were different empires. There was the Assyrian empires, the Babylonian empire, and those kingdoms, the Jewish kingdoms, fell to those different empires at different times. So the Jews in the north were exiled to Babylon faster or sooner, several hundred years sooner, I believe, than the ones in the south. But an interesting thing, for example, is alongside them existed other people, famously the Philistines. The Philistines were an ancient group. There is claim that the Palestinians are descended from them. I don't know how founded that is. But they were other people who existed at that time. And there was a constant, one of the roles that David constantly had was to fight the Philistines over land, territorial disputes, and stuff like that. Okay. And so that's kind of the lay of the land, very broad strokes, very broad. What happens eventually is that of the many empires that come through, we'll fast forward to the Roman Empire. Okay, the Romans take over. Christianity is already beginning. Okay, so the early Jesus has already been crucified if he existed, and that's already starting to unfold. And so now the Jews are under Roman rule, and there are actually 3 different revolts against this Roman colonization. Okay, the first one results in the temple being destroyed. So already that was a huge part of the Jewish presence that was already destroyed. The second one happened overseas, meaning it was Jews who had already living in the broader Roman Empire. And interestingly enough, that resulted in the Jews killing hundreds of thousands, if I'm not mistaken, of Roman civilians. Right? They just went at it at everybody. It was very brutal, and the Jews killed thousands and thousands of innocent Romans, which maybe that was an expression of the time. But again, already like early anecdotes of Jews committing atrocities, if you will.
Well, it was everybody. I don't know of
it was everybody. Yeah,
kingdom that didn't do that.
Exactly. I'm here. We'll talk about this later. There's a Jewish moral superiority that runs very deep through Jewish identity and in Zionism and the narrative. And so finding like some of those early evidence that like, no, we're just like everybody else. We're not better. We're not worse. We're capable of all the good and all the bad is an important thing, I think, to bring up. In the third revolt is the final revolt. It's called Bar Kokhba, it was particularly brutal. The Jews were particularly successful for a period of time. It was surprising how effective they were against the superpower that was the Roman Empire. They destroyed entire Roman legions, and they had a brief period of independence before the Romans came. They couldn't stand for such a thing, and they brutally crushed it. And that ended the presence in Israel of Jews. And the Jews, the Romans forcibly removed all the Jewish presence.
The same thing almost that they did to the Carthaginians.
I'm not familiar enough. My issue
Romans did that to Carthage, which is today's like
yeah, exactly. They would salt the earth so it couldn't even be plowed. They would go
delete all the books. I don't know how successful they were with the Jews, but with the Carthaginians, there's no more Carthaginian books, for example.
Exactly.
Libraries all gone.
Yeah. But it's interesting to note that even that last revolt, which resulted in the ultimate destruction of all the presence of the Jews in the land of Israel, was actually led by a group of religious zealots. So the broad majority of Jews living under Roman rule were like, okay, we'll deal with it, right? There was frustration with it, but there was a moderate majority and a fanatical minority. The minority revolted, and that's all you needed. And interestingly, they got a lot of support early on from the rabbis who were, in a sense, governing, helping lead at the time. And the rabbis saw it as almost like messianic vision. Like, we're going to break free. We're going to break free of the Roman rule, and we're going to have this Messiah era of a Jewish kingdom again with our own self-determination and self-rule, essentially. And so what then happened when that was crushed, it really broke this narrative that had potentially existed, and the rabbis had to basically completely go back to the drawing board and come up with a new conceptualization of what this idea meant of Israel and Jewish identity, because the dream had been so thoroughly crushed that they needed to keep going. They needed to come up with something new. Okay, so we see a couple of things here. We see this tenacity. The Jews really outsized force and outsized impact compared to their size. This unremitting, over and over again, throwing themselves at this brick wall called the Roman Empire that happened. It was futile, but they still didn't stop from doing it. They still kept trying it. And then a need to completely pivot. And we'll talk about this in a minute. So from then on, as the Jews are moved into exile, they adopt this new attitude that is far more spiritual. And it says things like, oh, we don't need a land of Israel anymore. We have our own internal governing system of a synagogue, of our own house, of studying Torah, of following the rabbis. And that can make you a good Jew and doing the right thing, no matter where you are in the world.
And I'm guessing that helped them survive for centuries without having a country.
Exactly. They essentially created an elasticity to the identity that was no longer linked to the specific location, which is what it used to be, and they allowed it to flow anywhere it wanted to be. I mentioned a lot of those things before because it parallels a lot of Palestinian behaviors, interestingly enough. This tenacity, this rebelliousness against all odds, a religious component, a almost fanatical zeal at like an uncompromising ideal of self-governance versus being under Roman rule. We'll talk about that more later, but I found the parallel really fascinating. And so what ends up happening for the last, I would say 1800 years overall, Judaism morphs from, the appeal of the land of Israel, or Zion as a concept, morphs from a real place to a utopian ideal. That one day God, not the people, because we've tried that and that didn't work, God is going to come, he's going to send the Messiah, and Messiah is going to bring us all back to the land of Israel. And that gave Jews a lot of hope. It was going to be God intervening on their behalf as they went through tremendous amounts of suffering. We'll talk about anti-Semitism next, but it became much more of almost like a myth, right? It became this sort of ideal that maybe they really genuinely wished for, but it was something that the rabbis cautioned against taking any steps towards it, for example. Okay, there's in the Talmud, it says, do not take up arms or do not fight against. There's this cautionary language and laws around doing anything that could provoke another Bar Kokhba type of experience. It's like, oh no, our role is God is going to save us. We're just going to survive. We're going to do what God wants. And when the time is right,
stay out of politics. That's what it's saying. It's saying stay the fuck out of politics.
Exactly.
And we will survive that way.
Yeah. And one of the sins is rushing the end, is what it's called. And that basically means is if God has a timeline for this, you don't get up and make that timeline occur faster. Right now you're messing with God's world, God's domain. So it's a fascinating way of instilling patience, right? Instilling, don't mess in politics, a necessary passivity for survival, which curbs that kind of like overarching urge to get up and do something and fight, and this is not okay, right? So that is the rabbinic Judaism, is the flavor of Judaism that we are very familiar with, and it's been, it still has evolved, but overall, if you think of it on a biological, like on a socio-evolutionary perspective, the fact that a religion has survived in some capacity of itself for 1900 years is fascinating in its own right. It's very successful. That how the words of the Talmud are still being studied hundreds of years later, that is itself a success. So there was something about that mix, right? That right mix of, I talk about Judaism having the mix of fear, the apple and the carrot and the stick. They had the right combo, the right amount of like standoffishness of not mixing with other people, but also kind of being involved. They did something right, and they survived for hundreds of years, which is a success for a sociological phenomenon, the anthropology of it all.
Well, let's also say that all the places they were at, because Rome made them leave their home country, right? And they went other places, and they developed a culture of, well, we don't need our home country, we'll just live everywhere else. And they were not just successful in their culture passing on generation to generation, but also they were successful in every one of those places, improving those places just as much as anyone else there. They were peaceful and productive, and that explains the kind of stuff I've been learning about. Is like if I look at the top 10 thinkers of my list, it's like more than 80% of them is of Jewish background.
Right.
Although European Jewish.
A lot of those people, a lot of the European Jewish, and a lot of those are in the last 200 years, and we'll talk about that. But it's true that throughout it all, they developed this very interesting combination of insularity, right, where they kind of stuck to themselves. They generally did not proselytize. They did not marry out. They kind of had some sort of self-sustaining thing, but they were very tenacious. They were, survived tremendous odds, and that tenacity over time, which we already saw them expressing even in their own country, right? That tenacity continued on. And so I think I was reading, and maybe you mentioned this, when they were expelled from Spain and they ended up in the Dutch countries, in the Netherlands, right, or the Dutch Empire, they basically helped the Dutch Empire grow its banking system in a way that, the Spanish banking tanked, and they experienced a period of, what's the word again? The hyperinflation, and so they had a long tradition. And I know it's almost a trope or a stereotype, and it could be didn't apply to all of them, but it was true that they often did get involved in the banking, in merchants, right? Sometimes there was technical reasons for that, like not being allowed to own land. Sometimes it was just a natural proclivity. I was reading an article once that claimed that a lot of like immigrant middle class, they don't become the ruling groups because they can't, but they rise up and they end up being like a really solid like upper middle class kind of peoples, and that can be found amongst other immigrants too. You can see that amongst Chinese who move to other places and stuff like that. So but that a broader exploration of how that happens. But broadly, there was two main places where they ended up. They ended up in Europe, broadly, which was the Roman Empire, and they ended up in what later became Muslim countries. Okay. Now, in the beginning, that was all under Roman rule, right? Rome all the way through Egypt and stuff like that. But eventually, when the Roman Empire collapsed,
all of that was Roman.
you end up with two broad groupings, right? So you end up with Jews who live in Europe and Jews who live under the Christians, essentially, and Jews who live under Muslim rule. And that experience, the experience of those was very, very different. So the Muslims were far more open to Jews. They had general policies against how do you treat somebody who's not Muslim, and they didn't care who wasn't a Muslim. Like you could be a non-Muslim Christian, or you could be a non-Muslim Jew, and everybody gets treated inferior but the same. Whereas the Christians were much more brutal. They basically hated the Jews on some level, but also tolerated them as sort of like they needed them as the grandparents of Jesus. There was a sort of love-hate. Christians generally did not tolerate anybody else. Okay, Jews got this pass, but it was a very reluctant pass. And so Jews,
at least the Christians during Roman times, when Rome decided to make Christianity the state religion.
Right, Byzantine.
And it was really, wasn't it the government really not liking the situation? Was it really the, Christians, individuals who hated Jews, or just the government that's...
I'm talking later on. It's interesting. I'm not the biggest expert on how it evolved, but it went something like this. Early Christians were actually Jews. They were Jews, and they were almost like a cult-like subsect of Jews who believed in all the Jewish stuff, plus that Jesus is the Messiah. And they were kind of very niche, and the Christians and the Romans hated them. They were persecuted more than anybody else. Okay, and that oftentimes has the effect of like making people more tenacious. So they actually stuck around, and there was a turning point where it could have been, it could have clicked, it could have not. And there was a Roman Empire. Constantine was the one who eventually decided to adopt the Christian beliefs. I don't remember if it was like a fuck you to the previous rule, or if he was struck by it. He had a pragmatic kind of approach. He ended up, I think, dying quickly. But that ended up with then by that time
he probably evolved it too, right? I mean, he might have been responsible for changing the religion also.
He changed the official Roman religion to Christianity. It would have been short-lived. I think there was like ideas to like undo it, but that didn't work. There was somebody who was going to roll it back and then died in battle. Something very seemingly archaic or almost like coincidental or accidental ended up with things going the way they did. And by then, by the way, the seat of the Roman Empire was in Constantinople, which is now in Turkey. Right, it is Istanbul at this point, and that became the Byzantine period of the Romans. Meaning, once the Romans adopted Christianity, that became the Byzantine.
What century was that?
Later than you'd think. This was around, I would say, 300 and 400 BC, current era. The Roman Empire was still around. It collapsed right into the Middle Ages. So right around 1400 is when the Roman Empire.
No, I mean, when did Rome adopt Christianity? That's what I meant.
Emperor.
You said Constantine. You mentioned Constantinople,
yeah,
but that's way later. I thought it was a few hundred years after Jesus. Is that not right?
It is. It took hundreds of years for this little cult to finally kick in. Right? It was about 400 years later. I remember 300 to 400. Yeah.
And it was evolving during that time.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And and I remember being fascinated by this, that like the idea of Jesus caught on 300 years after Jesus had already died, right? And it just, the tenacity of an idea in that sense, right? Could have gone so many different directions, and it clicked. So what you end up with is the Christians being really bad to the Jews, Muslims treating the Jews as second-class citizens, but that becomes a very different thing. But in both cases, it was all religious-based, right? So if you converted to the religion of the area, you immediately got an upgrade, right? The Muslims would treat you exactly the same. They didn't care where you came from. The Christians had this whole thing about like purity of blood and stuff like that. So
Racist, more racist than the Muslims.
It wasn't racism. Racism in the sense as that, like, it wasn't about. It was all about the religion that's running through your veins. Is it multi-generational? Is it not? But
how long your family's been that religion?
Exactly, that kind of thing, right? So it was not about you of a certain type. I'm sure there was discrimination around skin color and stuff like that. That runs very deep. But the interesting, and this is what I'm building up to, until most scholars call that period of time of hating Jews, they call it anti-Judaism. Judaism as a religion, and everybody doesn't like your religion, hates you. So Jews have suffered hundreds of years of anti-Judaism where they're just trying to stick to themselves and do their own thing, and everyone's always hating on them, kicking them out. They've suffered tremendously as a result of that. In the mid 1800s to late 1800s, there's a whole new trend around the Enlightenment, right? So science gets discovered.
There's a lot of atheists.
The theory of evolution is introduced, but along with that comes all these new scientific ideas that have since been rejected, but that was part of the trend. And one of that is basically racism. It's this idea, if you go with the survival of the fittest concept that Darwin introduces, that some races are better than others. Something will survive and some will die out, okay? So scientists start getting really obsessed with, do we see that in amongst humans? Are there better species of humans? Are there worse species of humans? Concepts like eugenics, right? Should we just cull the weaker ones so that the humanity can evolve into a greater species faster, right? If this is the nature of reality,
that sounds like the Nazi concept.
Exactly. So that was called I'm blanking, something Darwinism. It's like Darwinism applied to the human behavior, and it was not. I was just reading a paper that Hitler did not invent this. Hitler was building on narratives that are already there. They were present in England. They were present in the United States, and so now gets introduced a new concept called anti-Semitism, meaning Semite, someone of the Semitic background, biologically, someone who has those traits would be of a lesser type of human than another human. So suddenly it's not about what you believe, it's about what kind of body you have, right? That's what the Semitism comes in. And by the way, Hitler hated lots of people. He hated the Slavs too, okay? Like the Poles and the Russians, they were also an inferior people to him.
Well, and he hadn't gotten to them yet. He was going one by one, I guess.
No, he killed 3 million Poles, right? He got to everybody at the same time, and their stories are not as loudly told as the Jewish one, which we'll talk about. But you end up with this new thing called anti-Semitism, right? To hate the Semites, right? And this belief that you having a certain body type means that you act a certain way. You're a leech upon society, but that it is tied to your biology, right? And then you really can't escape it because you can't go anywhere else. So there's nothing you can do to change it. Doesn't matter what you try to do, how you try to assimilate, what behaviors you adopt. Well, this is the body that you have, okay? So this is a trend at the time, right? This is this whole new level of science, if you will, and looking at the world that way. And this is happening as colonialism, as we know it in its kind of more modern form. There'd been empires for many time, but this concept of colonizing was extremely popular all along the 1800s, right? It was all the biggest empires were doing it, and through that emerges this thing called Zionism. Okay, in the late 1800s. Emerges this nationalism becomes a trend, and it's like the turn of the century thing. You start seeing nationalism emerging in a lot of different places, and again, part of it is related to this newfound sense of identity around peoplehood, right? And maybe a sense of belonging around your people as opposed to belonging to a broader empire. And so here, from all of this, the famous origin story of Zionism is this anti-Semitic incident that Theodor Herzl witnesses in, I think it was France. He witnesses the Dreyfus trials, and this was a case in point. It's a perfect example. There was this military officer in France who was accused of treason or something like that, And at his trial, it was a very public trial, and there was all these anti-Semitic cries from the crowd. And so you have this guy who is completely secular. The Jews did a remarkable job just joining the broader, as soon as they were allowed to. There was this emancipation period in France and other places, late 1700s through the 1800s. The Jews assimilated wonderfully. They immediately merged into the upper echelons of science and became thinkers and writers and stuff like that, wherever they could be let into, and it didn't help, right? So you have still this anti-Semitism, this like hating of the Jew, even though he's a military officer in the French army. That's as integrated as it gets. And so seeing this man, Theodor Herzl, says, okay, what we need is a Jewish country of its own. The Jews need to be able to control their own destiny. And this is a part of a broader trend that's happening at that time. And so what we see for the first time emerging here is a reemergence of Zion, not as this utopian ideal, but as a pragmatic racial solution, right? The Jews as a people who've been hated for all this time, no matter where they do, no matter what they go, they need to have a place where they can govern themselves.
Now, it was atheist Jews
exactly
who made Zionism. And I guess you're going to be saying this next. They had to sort of trick or fool the religious Jews to buy into their Zionism.
Exactly. And they did not trick or fool anybody, right? It did not work for them at the time. They remained a fringe movement. The most of the Jews were of two different camps around them. There was either the highly secular and assimilated Jews who were very comfortable in Germany and all
like
these
an Einstein.
What?
Like an Einstein.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like Einstein, like Freud, right? They were just really comfortable in German society. It was a welcoming place for you to just be both, a German first and a Jew second, right? I think is one of the languages used, and let that coexist. And then you have the religious Jews who are still with that rabbinical attitude. We don't touch it. We don't do anything. We just wait for God to save us. Okay. And there's, by the way, segments of Jews who still believe that to this day. So the Zionist movement is both secular. It does not believe in like the Bible or God. It says we need a pragmatic solution, and it's fringe. It's a very small movement. And interestingly, some of its early supporters are either Christians, right, who believe in this kind of like utopian vision of Zion, a return to Zion, or anti-Semites who say this is a great idea. You're going to get out of our place and go somewhere else. And so
shit.
some of the early...
Yeah, I get what you mean.
Right.
Bunch of Europeans who weren't Jews like the idea of Zionism because they hate Jews and they want them out of Europe.
Yeah. So here's the Jews saying they want to get up and move. Great. You can do that. Okay. But there was also pragmatism to the Jewish, to this concept of Zionism that was basically saying it doesn't matter where we go, right? We just need to self-govern. If the idea that you're trying to solve is that you're trying to solve like the ability of basically an issue of power and self-determination, then we could do this in Uganda. And that was one of the suggestions. It was a British colony at the time. And why don't we go there? It was quickly rejected because it wouldn't be popular. But I think it's an indication of the deeper idea here. Zion as a utopia has to be a specific place and time, but you don't have to be there. You just have to dream about it. And Zionism is the reverse, where in the modern Zionism that we think of it, it's much more a place for the Jews to run themselves for the first time, but it could have been Australia or Alaska. These are all like supposedly recommended ideas. There's like a alternative thing.
Well, I think if they didn't pick the now area of Israel and they picked some other place like Africa, they wouldn't have been able to use Judaism, the theology, on Jews, right?
Exactly. Yeah. To a degree, I think they could have reverse engineered almost anything because I think there was an underlying thread that they tapped into of if we are doing it, we are returning to our homeland. But it was fascinating because it was very secular. A funny little anecdote. I live on the border of Canada and the United States near Buffalo, New York. And there's an island here that is kind of between the two. It's right next to Niagara Falls. And that island was one of these visionary spots where a Jewish guy living in America said, oh, let's make a little Jewish nation on this little island. It's tiny. I don't know how many tens of thousands of Jews it could have held, but it's commemorated as a spot that he envisioned for a future land of the Jews. This is in the 1800s. So what the Zionists start doing, right, is they bringing a lot of the ideas that are very popular in colonial times. This is the height of colonialism. You've got the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire. Everybody's doing this thing. And what you do is you go to an underdeveloped country and you tame the savages, right? You harness the resources and you also build trains at the same time. It's this mix.
Which is what colonialism was in every single case that these countries did it.
Exactly. It was not a new concept. It was all the rage back then. It was just how things were done. And when early Zionist banks and companies were founded, they had the word colonial in them. The modern day Bank Leumi, the National Bank of Israel, its early name was the Zionist Colonial
So they
Bank.
weren't even ashamed of the concept or the term, even.
No, that was the term used at the time. Some people will say, oh, colonialism meant something different back then, but I don't think you need to say that. That's just what was going on. You were a colony of an idea, and the companies, they all had the word colony in them.
They saw it as, we're making you better.
Yeah,
so you should like this. You're our colony, you should love it.
He had a very utopian vision. He was like, we're going to come there, and the savages will welcome us with open arms because ultimately we'll both benefit, right? We'll get new land, we'll get self-determination, and they'll get better agricultural systems. And the Zionists talk a lot about having come to the swamps in the northern Israel and planting mangroves and curing the malaria that was there. It's not politically correct to say this, but colonialism has its upsides, right? There was something that they were bringing to it. There was hospitals built and roads built. There were upsides. What often happens is that the main people who benefit from the upsides are the colonists, right? So it's not shared. The benefits, the fruits are not equally shared. And that's the main real side, that the greed usually comes into play in the middle.
Can I compare it to another example real quick?
Yeah.
So my parents are from Syria. After World War I, when the Ottoman Empire fell, and now the area of Syria was no longer under the Ottoman Empire, it was France that colonized that area. It wasn't very long. It was the shortest period of colonization than all the other Arab countries, as far as I know. I think it's like 20, 30 years. And when I talk to my mom about it, she speaks highly of what the French did.
Mm-hmm.
Improved our country. And she described what the Ottoman Empire ruling was like. And I agree with her. It really, now, here's the thing, too. I don't know, I don't think, how do I say this? I don't think the French took advantage of the situation. Like, they were first of all, they weren't taking, there was no resources there to take. It's not like we had a bunch of oil and then the French came and made companies and benefited. And then, our country didn't benefit from the oil or our own resources. That's not what happened at all. We had nothing. They came and just helped us.
I mean, I don't know. My assumption, I don't know much about the Syrian history, but I have no positive regard to colonial attitudes. And I generally assume that there is no utopian bettering of the world mission that they were actually operating on. That I assume that it was just pure greed. But that might be my somewhat slightly left-leaning views of things. There's always somebody to exploit, whether that's manpower, whether that's taxes, whether that's why not, like, how much are you putting in, how much are you getting out, right? And so my stance is the greed was underlying all of empire expansion, and that doesn't mean it was all bad. Right. But and you could speak highly of it. And I'm curious, this is just a theory. I'm curious if different stratas of a society would speak about it. Meaning, let's say you're closer to the top, middle class, and you benefit from it. But if you are like the peasant class, you might end up getting more just abused by it, right? Depending on whether you can cozy up to the people or so. Those are just some theories. I don't know anything about that space. But I can tell you that I do know that colonial involvement oftentimes was deliberately like a divide and conquer thing. So anytime there was like a movement to self-govern, to unify, this is a complete side point, but I was reading about a very brief desire to unify all the Arab countries under one, like kind of pan Arabic movement. And that I think could have been pretty cool. And it was kind of systemically destroyed by the French and the British. So They were oftentimes not out for the good of the people that they were in. If we go back to Zionism for a second, the interesting thing is that they were elitist in their own right. Okay, they did not care for, obviously, the savages living in Israel. They were almost a non-entity,
whether they were Jewish or not.
And that's the other point. They did not care for Middle Eastern Jews whatsoever. Who are these fools? Okay, so this attitude persisted through the founding of the state of Israel. It was like this unfortunate reality that we're like, we'll even take the Middle Eastern Jews, the African Jews, if we need to bolster our numbers. But they remained, the governing powers of Zionism remained European and Western to this day. They've always been the political ruling class in every single prime minister of Israel has been a European Jew, not a Middle Eastern Jew, as much as there's supposedly 50% of the country at this point is. But we'll get to that. They were brutal to everything. They had a very brutal attitude underlying it all. Their attitude towards the Holocaust was very pragmatic. There's writings around, as the Holocaust is unfolding, like, oh, this is good because Jews will be scared enough that they'll come here, right? Or there was at different points opportunities to bribe Hitler and let Jews come to Israel. So we'll pay him millions of dollars to help the Nazis flee. This was towards the end when things were falling apart, in exchange for Jews coming. And they're like, no, we need the money here in Israel. We're going to let Jews die in Europe because they're the ones who did not get up and come and join us. Okay, they assassinated other Jews. There's this famous religious Jew who came to Israel as a Zionist, looked around him and saw the Palestinians living there and said, this cannot be. And he started becoming a Palestinian advocate, an anti-Zionist voice, basically. And they assassinated him. They killed a religious Jew who was speaking out along the wrong sides. And before the founding of the Jewish state, there were like multiple religious group, Jewish resistance groups, basically terror groups of various levels of fanaticism. Okay, where the more extreme ones would do terror attacks against civilians. They would attack. They were very non-discriminatory.
And not just in Israel.
This is in pre-Israel, pre-founding of the state. This is under the British.
But not just in that area. They did it in other places.
Yeah, they had terror attacks in other places too. The ones that I know of and what I'm referring to are various attacks against the British and also against the Arab population. But the fascinating thing again is that it wasn't just a niche there. Once the state was founded, those various resistance groups were formed into the Israeli defense IDF, the Israeli military, and the leaders of those groups, a lot of them became future government individuals. So you have examples of the most extreme example is how should I phrase this? The Haganah was the biggest Jewish resistance group, and they were the most moderate. Like they generally tried to not be attacking civilians. So they were the more moderate ones, and they became the main, they absorbed others into them. But later on, decades later, Menachem Begin became the right-wing prime minister of Israel, and he had been the leader of the Irgun. And the Irgun was known for multiple terrorist attacks on civilians. So you end up, again, interesting parallel, with a prime minister who used to run a terror group that would kill civilians in terror attacks, right? And it's fascinating that, we whitewash it.
Now the term terrorism and terrorist attacks was used by the world about these acts and these people, right? That term.
I haven't gone back to the historical phrasing of it, but again, I was going to talk about this. The phrase "one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter." Okay,
and I noticed freedomfighter.com.
Exactly, that's my domain. Exactly. So if you want to become a freedom fighter, join me. The point is, I believe that we generally should condemn all attacks on civilians at all times. I don't care if it's Palestinians, if it's Jews, and a person who perpetuates those things should be decried and should have, that says something about their character and the type of person that they are. Keep that in mind at all times, right? And so I don't care if it's Jewish or Palestinian, but my issue begins when you start creating some sort of moral divide, where Menachem Begin is he's just a military hero, but Yasser Arafat is a terrorist, right? And where did you get that line to draw that line? Because both of them committed attacks against civilians and in a very deliberate way, in a way to instill fear. So if we summarize where the Zionists were at they were pragmatic. I think, and we'll talk about this in a bit. This is, I think, one of their biggest skills. They were pragmatic, okay? And so they were okay with this partition concept where they're not going to get all of Israel. They campaigned. Eventually, this proposition was suggested to divide Israel. So the Arabs would get one part, the Jews would get another part. And that was okay with them. They were not happy about it. They're like, we have nothing and we'll take something. The ability to continuously...
So they weren't foreseeing what's happening today?
I don't know if they foresaw that as a second step. I would like to be maybe naive and say no, they were willing to live alongside their Arab neighbors if that would have been accepted, because they were just desperate. That's kind of the narrative, and I'm willing to entertain that. That's the least of our problems. The what ifs are not our problems right now. So they're willing to negotiate with people who they did not agree with. There are fascinating anecdotes of suggestions of negotiating with Hitler, trying to get Hitler to release the Jews to come to Israel instead of him actually killing them. All sorts of they were willing to talk to whoever would listen, regardless of whose side that were on. Early Israel sided with the USSR, with the Soviets, against the Americans, right? They would talk to anybody who might be helpful here. In the 80s, I learned this recently, Israel covertly supplied arms to Iran. Iran, the sworn enemy of the Jews, they were providing weapons to Iran against Iraq because they wanted both of them to equally be fucking each other over. They wanted to prop up Iran against Iraq. Iraq was perceived as the biggest threat. At any given point, the Zionists will come in and say, what will serve our interest in this moment, in even a non-perfect way, and they will just go with that. And so one thing that we start to see, and you referred to this directly before, is this combination of combining secular and religious. They were founded by a bunch of atheists, but whenever necessary, they can invoke historic connection to the land. They can invoke symbolism that is associated with synagogues, like the Jewish star, right? They can invoke the menorah. So it is all very convenient to adopt Jewish identity when you want it and leave the rest go when you don't. And they, again, walk the line really well. And same thing with historic and modern. They were all about the future and creating a modern state of Israel and fuck the past, and we're not going to be like sheep to the slaughter. We're not going to be those people who, for thousands of years, the Jews have been oppressed by their oppressors. We're going to stand up and be free, right? But if we need to point to the past, it's like, oh, we've been here for a long time and stuff like that, that they were always willing to do. And that is admirable. I think we'll talk about it later. I think that's one of the main things that Palestinians lack is this flexibility in thought and the pragmatism of value where, just do what'll be best for you now, not the ideal state that you deserve or should get. Okay, I'll pause there, and I wanted to now talk about the Holocaust and how it influenced it, and basically the main Zionist narrative and what's wrong with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a dumb question in between. You mentioned something earlier about the way in which the Jews as a group, or Judeans, I'm not sure which is which, as a group were at the same time embracing other people, but also keeping separate, you said. And something that I see today, and I want to ask you, did it exist in the far past? Anyone can be a Jew today. Like, you can become Jewish, the religion, right?
Okay.
Was that true 2,000 years ago?
It's a great question, and it's sometimes hard to know because there's a sort of overarching narrative that's been imposed on all other things. So first of all, in today's modern time, it's actually quite difficult to be a Jew. New people who want to join the population are met with a lot of reluctance. There's a lot of like, are you sure you really don't need to? They really kind of made to jump through many hoops.
That sounds good to me, though. But anyway,
yeah, apparently, it weeds out the non-committal. There's a lot of people who are not committed. Anyways, in the different sects of Judaism, there's different amount of openness. Orthodox Jews really give you a hard time. Reform Judaism is like, here, read this book and you're Jewish. So that varies as well. And you end up with different points in time. There was actually anecdotes from the Hasmonean period, which was was the last Jewish dynasty where there are actually Jewish kings running the land. This is a few 100 years before the Romans took over. And the Hasmonean period, they had forced conversions. They would go and do what Muslims are famous for, Christians are famous for, and they took groups of people and made them be Jewish, right? That's an extreme other example, and it's many, many hundred years ago. But again, a case in point where you get different flavors of Judaism at different points in time. There is no one way of it being. It's sometimes brutal, sometimes it's oppressed, and that was. But throughout, there was generally not a lot of evangelizing. The Jews are like, just leave us alone. We'll do our own thing. We won't let you in. It was this sort of like weird elitist kind of like, we're superior. We're God chosen people. We don't need you. We're not going to really mess with you, but we'll do business with you, right? And that kind of level of insularity can be really annoying, frankly. If we talk about anti-Semitism, a joke that I love is anti-Semitism is the definition of hating Jews too much. Hating Jews more than is appropriate.
Okay.
So there definitely, things that Jews may have done throughout the years that raised the ire of, that were not well integrated with, society at large. But does that, justify death and destruction and expulsion? Probably not, right? Very much likely not. So what happens is Zionism is still a fringe. It starts in the 1800s. You get these movements of actually, interestingly enough, there was parallel movements of Jews who were religious. The first settlers in Israel were religious Jews. They were not Zionists. They were coming back to Israel because they saw this, again, as a holy land. And it wasn't about self-governance. There's all these laws that Jews have that only apply in the land of Israel. Okay? You only do them if you're in Israel. So they were like, we want to be in God's chosen country. It doesn't matter who governs us. We could be under the Ottomans. We can answer to anybody. We just want to be here. This is a holy land. And so some of the early movements of settling Israel were actually just religious Jews, actually, who just wanted to return to the Holy Land. And you also there was probably a small presence, I believe throughout, a few thousand, it's almost negligible, a few thousand people living in the land of Israel who were Jews throughout. And they may have been probably of Middle Eastern descent, like Yemenite and stuff like that. It makes sense that almost any country in the world you drop into, you're going to have some sect from somewhere, who's from somewhere else. But it's a fringe movement, right? There's literally a few tens of thousands of Jews living in Israel throughout, the 1900, 1910, 1920. Okay, and it starts to become a little bit more of a trend, but nothing that would like become a tipping point. And actually, the population of the Arabs living there also rises, and always at a much greater proportion. I just saw a fact that in 1800 there was 7,000 Jews living in Israel and 250,000 Arabs. Okay, that's the parallel. And so the numbers continue to move that way, with the Jews always being a minority. And then the Holocaust occurs. And suddenly this fringe thing called Zionism that nobody really wants to buy into because we're comfortable here becomes the savior. Becomes like, oh my gosh, we are not safe anywhere. This confirms it and ends up pushing Jews into Israel, into Zion, in a way that is both ideological, like, oh, they were right, like we need this, and in a physical way, like they're refugees and they need to come to Israel. And so what starts to happen post World War II is this massive influx of Jews, which suddenly finally tips the scales of the population, right?
And this is doing, so 1917, it's now British rule.
Right? Post 1917, it's British rule. So a lot of this is happening.
So they're moving in for a big chunk of this. They're moving in during British rule, and yes. But during the Ottoman rule, they were moving in also.
It was fringe in the Ottoman rule. What they started to do in the Ottoman rule was buy land. This was the earliest venture, which we mentioned before, the colonial movements and stuff like that. What they did is they founded companies, let's say in England, okay, and they would even issue stocks. So you could buy stock in a company, and they would fundraise from Jews, from wealthy Jews all over the world who can buy shares basically in this movement. The Jewish, I think it was the Jewish National Fund, one of these kind of 3-letter J something, and they were buying land in Israel and then building farms and Jewish colonies on that land that they had purchased. Now, interestingly enough, I recently read that the way they were doing these purchases is because this was Ottoman rule, the local lands that were being farmed by the Palestinians living there were actually owned by absentee landlords in, let's say, Turkey or something like that, or in Syria or whatever. But so you go to a landlord who's not even there, and he's like, "Can I pay you a bunch of money for your land?" And he says, "Sure." And you go and you kick the local farmer off, right?
Yeah.
And so that starts to breed a resentment. And in the 1920s, starts to rise up counter to Zionism, this sense of Palestinian identity, right? So it was not really a thing before. The local population was comfortable with just being under Ottoman rule and broadly identifying.
I don't think anyone was comfortable under Ottoman rule except for maybe Turks.
Right, but it was just, there was no desire to, there was no seemingly any movement to be anything else other than we're the people of Jerusalem. We've got our Jerusalem leader, and that's about it, right? And there was much more geographical based identity, and it wasn't a nationalist kind of brotherhood. It emerged as a counterculture to Zionism and as an emerging trend, and you can see this in multiple Arab countries at the same time. You can see it emerge in Syria, in Egypt, in Jordan. All these people, as colonialism starts, reaching its peak and then decline, right? These individual peoples who are under the yoke of colonialism start to adopt these new ideas of why don't we govern ourselves as a separate.
I want to clarify for people: the Ottoman rule itself, we were colonized. My parents are from Syria and many generations before that. So that area, we were colonized by, if we call ourselves Arabs, and I'm going to correct that in a second. If we call ourselves Arabs, we were colonized by the Turks, and it was very oppressive. We didn't like it.
Right.
That was like 400 years.
And the Turks are not Arabs, by the way.
Right.
To be clarified. The Turks are not Arabs.
They were Muslims.
Yeah.
They were Muslims, but they're not Arabs, and they kind of, they're racist like a lot of other places. So they were very oppressive to the Arabs.
Yeah.
But even if you were to say you call me an Arab or my parents Arabs, we were also colonized previously. Islam colonized us and turned us into Arabs and Muslims, erased our culture. I don't know. I couldn't tell you what the language was that my ancestors spoke because it got deleted.
Yeah.
And of course, there were many even before that. You mentioned a few empires. Every one of those was, we didn't call it colonialism, but every empire is that. It's making colonies, except far back in the past, it was all one unit physically, because you couldn't go far places with ships. But when you have ship technology, like the way in the 1700s, like Britain and Spain do, you can colonize very distant places.
Right.
But it's basically an empire.
Right.
Anyway, I just wanted to give a little bit of context.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And so it's a long line, and it's interesting. We'll talk about this in a bit, but the Ottomans were absolutely brutal, and they committed genocides of their own against the Armenians. And it's telling that the Jews never acknowledged the Armenian genocide, which again we can talk about what that means and why that happens. But what basically happened, so the Holocaust is actually the key of what Israel ultimately became successful, because it shifted the perceptions of the world. Suddenly everyone acknowledged that, oh yeah, the Jews do need a place to defend themselves. And it actually, so the world feeling bad for Jews and allowing them to be like, okay, you do deserve your own place. And the physical catalyst of the Jewish mindset of like, we need our own place. And the physical refugees who came and were the early founders of the state. Okay. And so because of that, very clearly, as soon as the Holocaust happened, it became adopted as a key educational component to explain why Zionism was necessary. And that's only grown in the decades that followed. It became this obsessive part of what it means to be Zionism. You know why we need Zionism? Because we don't want the Holocaust to ever happen again.
We're not safe, and we need Israel to be
exactly.
safe.
And so then one of the next techniques is if you deny our ability to have our own land, you are basically saying that you let us die and you are an anti-Semite. Okay, so this became a linking the need for the land of Israel, the justification for Israel existing in its form, became synonymous with do you want Hitler to kill us again, which is not at all an equation, right? But what they did is they got Holocaust survivors and Holocaust scholars to all create this consensus. So there's two broad definitions of is anti-Semitism include anti-Zionism or not? And what they now have going is this movement that basically says if you criticize Israel's basic right to have existed, you are anti-Semitic. And now everybody's afraid to do that because nobody wants to be called an anti-Semite. It's a very convenient safe place.
And you're not even saying that it shouldn't exist today. You're saying if you question how it came to be in the first place, then you're anti-Semitic.
That I don't know, and I make that distinction myself. I say, look, Israel's a country like any other. Every modern country is founded on atrocities and displacing people, and Israel's behaviors at the time were par for the course and done by a lot of other people. They were not justifiable, but they were, and we're 70 years later. We do need to move on from that very specific point in time. But an injustice was committed, and whereas other countries, hopefully to a greater or lesser degree, have acknowledged that, Israel has not. And that we'll talk about now Israel's propaganda, but Canada did this to the indigenous and provide millions of dollars of reparations and has like dedicated territories that they get treated well and they get like special benefits. And there's still the oppressed of Canada, right? And they still need to be built up. And same thing to the indigenous of the United States. So it exists in other places. The people who have done probably the least amount of acknowledging this type is like the British, who done very
Really,
little.
the British? I'm surprised you say that.
Have the British like atoned for their sins of destroying most of the world? Like, I don't see the British. They just gone on and drank tea. I don't see the British. The British and the French really fucked the world over. The Dutch also, right? All of Africa, all of the Middle East. If they devoted their rest,
because they were the newest ones.
They were the newest. Yeah, they're new. They were modern. If we look at history today, at the lines drawn on maps, we can say, you know who caused that fuckery between India and Pakistan? The British. The British could spend the next 100 years devoting most of their GDP towards rehabilitating the countries that they fucked over, and they probably wouldn't still atone for what they've done.
The weird thing they did, okay, they ruled India for 800 years, and then when they decided to leave, they just quickly left. I think since you were there for 800 years, it's your responsibility to help them actually have a stable situation and slowly leave, iteratively.
Exactly.
Not just fucking run, which they, by the way, pretty sure they did that in Israel too.
They did the same thing in Israel. They hightailed it out in a couple months, and the country went to shit, which is very normal. Because they also waited until things got horrific right before they did. So it was a combination. They didn't want to stay around a moment longer. The United States just did that in Afghanistan, right? They did the same kind of thing. They got out with almost no notice, and they were gone.
And now Afghanistan is going backwards again. Like they're making laws against women. They can't go to school and shit.
Exactly. Horrible. So now we have. I want to talk about Israel developed in the 90s, especially this concept called Hasbara, which literally in Hebrew translates to explaining. A less charitable explanation would be justifications, right? Now they're trying to move away from that language, but I grew up with these programs that were all about teaching Jews to explain to the world how Zionism got to this where it is and why it's okay. And I want to run through some of those lists. So the talking points are Israel, the Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel. Okay, this is a huge, huge claim. We're not coming back to conquer. We're not Europeans. We've always been here. And they point to two main things. One, the fact that there was always some Jews in the land of Israel, as if like, oh, you put your pinky toe in the swimming pool and now the whole pool is yours kind of thing, right? And then the other part is like, we've always been talking about it. We've been talking about Zion for whatever. It's a huge part of our identity. And the fact that it's like in their mind, like I've been singing songs around the campfire, so now this country is mine. I find both those claims absolutely absurd, right? But that is a huge part of the starting point of it all, especially since Israel is actually still is run by European elites who are secular, okay, who don't believe in most of the day-to-day stuff. They don't live according to that. They resent the religious who run a lot of the country. They do not really want it to be run that way. The second talking point is that they're all victims. They're here because Hitler killed them. They're here because they were kicked out of all the other places. They're all refugees. And so the underlying assumption is if they are victims, they cannot also be perpetrators, right? How we would never do a genocide. We received the genocide, right? And so it's an inability to acknowledge that you could be the victim of one thing and be the most powerful in a new place and immediately become an oppressor there. And it's worth mentioning, Jews always rose to the amount of power that they could wherever they were and had, hundreds of years in living in Western society. So they were highly influential in British culture. They had British Jewish millionaires, the Rothschild family, who was some of the early funding to colonies in Israel came from the Rothschilds. They had a lot of influence in the United States. right? They went on
And still
fundraising
do
missions.
today, more than before.
Even more today, but even then, when there was still like no Jews allowed on the country clubs, there were still rich, wealthy Jews. Golda Meir, Ben Gurion, before the state was founded in the 30s, would go on fundraising trips and raise like millions of dollars to go and advocate and buy land and buy weapons and stuff like that. The Palestinians had nothing. They were local Bedouins who were doing their thing, who were slowly assuming a state of identity. So where they were a lot more fresh to this entire thing called Western government, right? They did not have.
I'm not sure it's accurate to say that they're Bedouins. From what I understand, what
Bedouin
means.
that's
Bedouin
bad.
means like the people that are not in the city. They're city people in this area, except the point is they didn't get hit by the European Enlightenment.
Exactly. Yeah. And I stand. Thank you for correcting me, because Bedouins are a group that live in Israel and they're nomadic and they have like sheep and stuff like that. But no, on the contrary, the people that were settled, and that's again, that was me with a myth repeating a thing that was often repeated, which is that which is my next point, that it was an empty land. There's this famous Mark Twain quote that people love to quote. He came in the 1800s. There was almost nobody there. This place was empty. We just showed up. It was sitting there waiting to be taken, right? Which doesn't acknowledge
It's one of the oldest places in the world.
Yeah. And again, I don't think it was the beaten track. It was a lot of pilgrims and stuff like that. But there was between 250 and 500,000 Arabs living in what is now the land of Israel, in Palestine, 1800 in that century, in those 100 years. And it started to grow rapidly in the turn of the century for a variety of factors. Okay. And so part of that being a victim is this narrative, the Zionists, the underdog. Okay. This is a huge part of the forming of the state. Okay. Where the huge narrative is, we were just there, we were a minority, we just wanted some place to ourselves, a little corner, and then everybody declared war on us, right? We said yes to the partition, the Palestinians said no, we had to go to war, we almost died, we finally survived, what do you want from us, right? So this concept, and part of that is like an existential threat. Israel is so small, the borders can barely be defended, it needs to have more space because otherwise you could drive a tank through and the whole place is cut off, and so on and so forth, right? And so this was the narrative from the founding of the state until the 80s, when a bunch of historians came on called the New Historians, okay? And they did their own research and introduced a new narrative that says, no, it was never as bad for the Jews as the Jews would like to paint it, okay? Where there was a tremendous amount of power that the Zionists had from the beginning that way outweighed the local Palestinian Arab power at the time, the Western roots, diplomacy, wealth, having a head start. They had been going at it for...
Can I throw one in there? Okay, military power and military skill. When Israel was formed around that time, the Israeli military force was people that already had a lot of experience in World War II.
Yes.
The guys they were fighting, the Arabs or whoever, and the Turks, they didn't have anything. They were working on technology and skills and military prowess from 100 years earlier.
Right.
That was not a real fight. So yeah, you're right. If they're gonna say, "Hey, we were weak,"
yeah,
no, not at all.
Exactly. And that was literally my next point, because not only had they fought in World War II, there was an Arab uprising while the British were still ruling. The Arabs tried to revolt for like 5 years. They were brutally suppressed by the British, while the Jews joined with the British. So they collaborated. So the Arabs basically were a lot of them were imprisoned, killed, or exiled. Okay, during those 5 years, so they were severely weakened, and their economy was weakened because they boycotted. So they basically ruined their own economy while trying to revolt. The revolt was unsuccessful, and the Jews got experience working alongside the British in policing the security of the British. So the British gave them military training and said, okay, they did this in India too. I think you can become a paramilitary force that helps keep order in the land. You could be a policeman, you could be stuff like that. So they actually got, even before the war.
And here's the point. They were friends with the British. The Arabs weren't really friends with the British.
The British went back and forth during their entire rule, where sometimes they were pro Jewish, sometimes they were pro-Arab, and it basically depended who was talking to them at a given moment or what interest was happening. They were completely two-sided. They did this a lot. They would promise two different things to two different people and let them sort it out once they left. Okay, so there was the British were beyond useless. They fostered a lot of animosity between the peoples that they were involved with. They sowed chaos. But exactly that point where the invading armies, while technically in the beginning of the war were superior in numbers, as far as training, they were inferior and they were fragmented. So the whole multiple armies invaded, it's true, but each of them had its own agenda. The Jordanians wanted a slice for themselves. The Egyptians wanted a slice for themselves. They were working against each other. It wasn't like this unified force. And as the war lasted about 8 months, and during the entire war, there's an influx of Jewish refugees coming in who were handed guns. They show up and they're handed a gun. And by the end of that war, the Jewish size of the military had doubled. They had gone from 60,000 to 120,000, and they did at that point also outnumber the invading Arab armies. Part of that talking point, though, is the Arabs invaded and they lost. Right, that was a huge talking point that I grew up with, which doesn't distinguish between the Palestinians who were there physically and the invading Arab armies who either had an agenda of supposedly protecting them or getting a slice of it for themselves. Huge distinction, right? So when you beat the invading Arab armies, very nice. Maybe you deserve to. The UN said you could have a slice here, but you. How does that explain the Arabs who are literally in this land?
You know, right? I never thought about that basic point, but it just reminds me of another basic one. There's people who say, like on behalf of Israel, as an example, Mossad, the son of the one of the co-founders of Hamas, he says, "Look, everybody over there, they're all Hamas, even the babies." Come on, that's not fair. That's not fair. That's a baby. I'm, you know, as a kid, it's not my fault what my parents did. And like what you just said, the people living in Palestine, Palestinians, it's not their fault what the other Arab nations were doing. Even the people in those Arab nations also. There's a few leaders that are making these decisions.
Right.
And not the people of those countries.
Yeah, I mean, look, the two things to add that I forgot to add. One is that the partition plan that the UN voted for was very biased, meaning they divided the country about 50-50. But the problem was at the time of the division, there was far more Palestinians than Israelis living in the country. And so it was already unfair to the Palestinians. You can understand why the Palestinians rejected it. Again, this is a talking point. It's like, I don't know, the UN said they should divide it. The Palestinians said no. We said yes. And so we went to war. But you can understand why they went to war. The Palestinians are like, based on what was this divided? And it was based on all sorts of dealings and handshakes that happened between the Zionists and the Western countries.
And the Arabs and Turks weren't involved in it.
The Turks were definitely not involved. They were out of the picture for decades. But with the but the Arabs were not involved either, right? It happened behind their back. They appealed. The United States was powerful. The Soviets were powerful, and they got ruled out. But then the second point is that there was two stages to the War of 1948. The first was a civil war between the Palestinians and the Jews living in the land, and then at a later point, months into it, the Arab countries around it got up and tried to invade it, intervene to try to help shift the tide. But it was too late, and it did not work at all. So I will not say that the Palestinians did not take up arms against the Zionists, but there was an unfairness that they were fighting. Okay, and again, there was a lot of civilians involved. Just because you have the militant groups fighting other military groups, that does not justify what actually occurred, which was not just Jews defending the original argument of like, oh, the Jews should have their own place, but the Jews then went and the Zionists went and systemically expelled Arabs from their villages. Some of the flight was just, it's a war zone, you run away. Some of it was deliberate massacres that they conducted in different villages. They had a plan. I'll give you a link afterwards. It's called Plan Dalit, Plan D. Okay, and it was a plan for how do we systemically take over as much of the land as possible to create a shift where we are the majority ruling class. It was all about ethnics. Okay, the ethnicity is all about this. And again, fascinating inverse. Okay, all of anti-Semitism is essentially, oh, Jews are a different class of people. Zionism is reverse anti-Semitism, where they say we are uniquely oppressed people. We must have our own land. Okay, you cannot live in our country with us because we won't be safe. So we're going to be racist about that. Okay, and so that is a huge part of the governing narrative. So they live though with this moral superiority, like, Us? How could we possibly do this kind of thing? We're the most moral country in the world. We're the only democratic country in the Middle East. They repeat these talking points all the time, and they completely ignore the fact that there were Jewish terror organizations. Jewish terrorist leaders became politicians, right? Ariel Sharon, okay? Ariel Sharon, famous Jewish prime minister, he led the massacre of a Jordanian town where they went in and killed dozens of civilians in a retaliation attack against a terror attack. They just went and blew up houses and killed civilians. Okay, and he became the leader. Okay, that's just decades later. That's who you're talking to. They talk about being the democratic country in the Middle East, but the fact is that they're racist, both to their own people, but more importantly against the Arabs who are in the land, and they're governed by like religious laws all the time. So let's say two gay people can't actually get married in Israel. Okay, so democratic by what standard? Okay, so there's like
it's similar democratic problems that we have in the U.S. I think
there are a lot of the same ones. The problem is that a lot of those Israeli ones are not just like problems of like, you know, enlightenment. Yeah, look, maybe it is the same because the U.S. is a very Christian country too, as opposed to like more of Europe, which is more liberal. And so you end up with this issue of religion sinking in. Just in Israel's case, it's the Jewish religion. And so the fact that Judaism comes in and whatever Jewish ideas around race, around identity come in, they influence how the country runs, right? So let's say you are Muslim minority living in Israel. Well, too bad. They're going to be keeping the Jewish holidays, right? They're going to be having no buses on Saturday, but they're going to have buses on Friday. I don't know if Muslims are not allowed to drive on Friday, but
not really.
Yeah, exactly. But those are the kinds of things where it is not nearly as democratic as it pretends to be, or if it's democratic for its own sect of race, essentially. And throughout it all, there's just a ton of lying and censorship and whitewashing. The population in Israel doesn't see a lot of the atrocities that are committed in the West Bank and in Gaza. They just get a much more filtered view than even the rest of the world does.
They get lied to just like the rest of us are getting lied to in the rest of the world.
Exactly. Like you might see worse pictures in any other country other than that place. So they're part of that. They will deny things, then they will whitewash things. They will do a whole series of things around it. And so my real conclusion here is that as far as Zionists, what Jews have, the factors that are at play here is tenacity. Jews are incredibly tenacious. Do not fuck with the Jews because if they can, they will remember for years who they are and what they are. It is like they are an extremely tenacious people, but now they have power. Okay, and with that power and that tenacity, it is extremely what has occurred to the people they're oppressing is unforgivable on many levels. And so my punchline is Jews are not inherently special, nor are they inherently moral, which is a huge foundational claim. Jews are more moral, and they're not inherently victims. They happen to have been victims through a lot of modern Western history. They're not victims in China, right? That's not how it goes. But in the Judeo-Christian Muslim world that we live in, Jews have been victims for a lot of the time, but that doesn't preclude them from turning around and becoming perpetrators in the modern era as soon as they're given half a chance, which they were. That's the main premise. I would say, like, one of the things I wanted to say that I believe the Palestinian mistakes in all of this have been a couple things. I think the main one is perfectionism. And you can maybe add to this from a perspective of like Arab or Muslim culture, like this ideal of like honor or things being in an ideal kind of way, as opposed to a potential pragmatism. So whether that's in negotiations, right? The biggest offer was 1948. They could have said yes and had their own country. Was it fair? Absolutely not, right? It was fucked. But they never had a country before, and they were handed the chance to have their own governing country, and they said no. And it's been mistake after mistake after that with worse and worse odds, right? What they're being offered now in negotiating table is a fraction of what they could have received then. And same thing with this obsession with right of return. Like Palestinians wear like a key around their neck that of the house that they lost, that they had since the Ottoman times. And by the way, this is fascinating. Jews make fun of that. The Zionists are like, what? You can't even get over your shit. You can't get over your identity as a victim. Meanwhile, Jews literally thrive on being victims. It's like a huge tenet of the Jewish identity. But specifically, I really recently read that when Jews were exiled from the Roman lands, okay, they took their keys with them. It was a part of it. Okay, so it is all these sentiments. It's very human. It's very normal. Okay, and Jews have been doing it for millennia. But the obsession that Palestinians have with, I want to go back to that house, that just makes it inflexible for discussion. You're not going to get that house. It's very unfortunate, but the move is, we're 70 years later, The world has moved on. The most you can get is your own country, your own self-governance. But it's going to be different than it was. And I think the other big criticism is the Palestinians who do support terror attacks against civilians. I do not condone it across the board. I do not condone Jews doing it. I do not condone Palestinians. And unfortunately, because of indoctrination and radicalization, from the polls that I've seen, the majority of Palestinians support terror attacks against civilians and stuff like that. And that is a real, it gets used as a propaganda talking term by Zionists, by Israel. But it sounds, unless I stand corrected, to be founded in fact. And that is a real issue.
Yeah, I don't claim to understand it very well. A couple things I'll say about that is, in the 80s, and I don't know how far back, but when the PLO, and I forget who the main leader was for most of that time. The one you said the name earlier.
Yasser Arafat.
Yasser Arafat. So, from what I understand, he happened to be a Muslim, but he wasn't arguing his politics from Islam.
No, he was not.
That group wasn't doing that.
Exactly. Like Hamas is a Islamist terror group with the ideals of like taking over all of Israel, whereas the PLO is a secular.
But the point though. So, what I understand is the people in that area saw that the PLO was failing at its job. They probably also saw some corruption in the PLO too, and I'm trying to understand this from their perspective. And it's like, look, if our leaders are fucking up like this, and there's this other group who is saying, no, we're gonna try it a different way.
Yeah,
I could see people saying, all right, let's try it that way without caring so much about the details of how they're doing it. Similarly, in the US, there's a lot of people that voted for Trump, not because they like Trump, but only because they hate the other guys more.
Exactly.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. So maybe a lot of the support for Hamas isn't even religious. It's, well, let's try something.
It could be. And Hamas, again, if you put it in parallel to a sort of a corrupt central government and Hamas being a populist, more right extreme government that like says, no, we're going to look out for you. But I think the another factor here is a lot more basic and not pretty. And that is that it's very easy to educate generations of people to hate an entire other class of people. And you get that in both extremes, especially right now in Israel. This sort of like hyping up of like the anti-Semitism and the abuse or whatever. Again, it's all framed as anti-Semitism, like the attack on Israel's like they're attacking us because we're Jews and all that type of stuff. That victimhood thing can be easily subverted into this really, really defensive, instinctive race war, which Israel is actively feeding into and which the Palestinians have also been feeding into. And they're basically saying the entire other people just wants to kill us. We got to kill them first. We hate all of them. They're different species. Israel has in Judaism, there's a concept called Amalek, which is this like ancient people that tried to kill the Jews. So we're commanded to kill every man, woman, and child. It's a genocidal wish. It's celebrated every year in the holidays. And whenever it's convenient, you invoke Amalek upon your enemies. So the Germans were traditionally Amalek. That was like the Germans, they tried to kill all of us. We need to kill all of them. Okay. And now the Palestinians, they're the latest incarnation of Amalek who just wants to kill the Jews. And in that place, I've got family, I've got relatives who will be like, oh yeah, we should just carpet bomb all of Gaza. Right. That is very similar to the Palestinian equivalent of supporting terror attacks. So I don't condone it across the board and both sides. And what Israel gets to do is drop bombs from the air and walk away. Palestinians need to walk up and shoot somebody in the face. That's the power.
Oftentimes it's rocks, right?
What?
Oftentimes it's rocks.
Yeah, or fire bombs, right? You can see the imbalance of power in the casualties on the Palestinian side versus the Israeli side, right? There are thousands of Palestinians in Israeli jails, and there are currently 200 hostages in Palestinian territory, and those are treated as different. And so on and so forth. And the parallels are crazy because when Israel does something, it's self-defense, and when the Palestinians do it, it's a terror attack. I will say it's interesting. I do find this distinction fascinating. I was reading through a list of massacres that Israel has perpetuated since the founding of the state, and there are many. But some of the massacres are basically bombings, especially recently in Gaza. So Israel will bomb a school. I don't even know why they do it, and now you end up with like 100 civilians dead. Okay, and that's called a massacre, which I always grew up thinking a massacre is a bunch of people running into a building and shooting people. And the distinction is you can draw the line either way. But if that's a massacre, then all of the bombings, I grew up as a child, and bosses were constantly explode with suicide bombings, especially in the mid 90s, and again in the 2000s. And that was
You're saying they should be called massacres.
That should be called a massacre, and then you have a bigger list for the Palestinian side. So we should stabilize the terminology and figure out what we're calling what, and not not err from it. Israelis love, basically most of what Israel has done in the last 70 years has been condemned by international law. And what Israelis do in their own little bubble is they say, well, you've hated us for 2,000 years. Why should we listen to you? They hide behind the same victimhood.
They have the U.S. on their side.
Yes.
From what I understand, primarily because, well, let's call it two things: a lot of money, AIPAC, and the former versions of it, and then also this thing that has been called Christian Zionism.
Exactly. Yeah. And America is now one of the most Christian countries, right? And so they get these powerful groups of Christians who support Israel. And another third reason is more pragmatic, that during the Cold War, Israel emerged, not initially, but fairly quickly, from 1967 onwards, as an ally of the United States against Russia. So all the Arab countries side with the USSR. Israel became a bastion of the United States political interests in the Middle East. And that was very cozy for America, and that was very convenient. And Israel has just maintained that status against other forces, whatever they need to control in the air. So that was a huge factor. But it's fascinating because in 1956, there was a war between Israel and Egypt, essentially. And it was Israel, France, and Britain, the three colonial parties, fighting Egypt because they wanted control of the Suez Canal. And it was Israel, and it was the United States and Russia that intervened. The USSR intervened against it. And that was the last time. Since then, there's been a flip where Israel just took a side, they joined the US and stuff like that.
Well, from what I understand, right before that event, the British, or it was either the British or the British and the French were big players, considered big players. And then by the end of that event, they were no longer big players, and it was the US.
France had a colony in Algeria until, I believe, the mid-70s. It's crazy how recent some of this stuff was going on, okay? And so there was a huge campaign of terror in Algeria, and that drove the French out. And I believe that was studied by Arafat, and he said, well, why don't we do the same thing also in Israel? Let's drive the Israelis out. There are important distinctions that Israelis like to make, that they've got nowhere else to go. They are all people who fled other countries. They're not, when Zionists try to make the "we're not colonists" claims, they talk about how colonialization traditionally is a power, sets up a branch somewhere else, starts milking it for its resources, and that's not happening here. Okay, we're not sending the money anywhere else, so we're not a colonial power. But so what, right? It's an arbitrary distinction, and they're sending the money to themselves. They're taking Palestinian land, they're taking Palestinian resources, and they are just living off it themselves. That's basically what's happening.
Also, it might be a misnomer to say that all those people escaped persecution from all these other countries, because more recently, the people that go to Israel and become Israelis, they were totally fine where they were. They just choose to come because they get to have stuff.
Exactly.
So as an example of a statistic, if I understand correctly, 23,000 soldiers in the Israeli Defense Force are actually Americans first, citizens that got the option to come over here because of their Jewish background, and now they are Israeli soldiers.
100%. And I was a social worker in the army. I was in charge of those foreign soldiers, helping them, give them support because their families were not necessarily living in Israel. And that's exactly the point. There are Jews living all over the world, and Israel actively encourages immigration because they're still in a battle of demographics. The biggest war in Israel is demographics. And you see this is what is so inherently unfair. Israel just went to war with Hezbollah, and they went to war for 1 month. It was terrible. It was terrible for the Lebanese. They made a ceasefire and they backed off. The Hezbollah, everybody agreed, were far more powerful than the Palestinian Hamas ever was. And Israel has been in Gaza for 13 months, right? they've been just bombing the shit out of it for over
I
a
think
year.
the point you're making is, why didn't you do a ceasefire earlier?
Yeah, so let's just get very clear that this whole, again, this goes to the earlier talking point of Israel's existential threat. Why is Israel at war? Because they need to survive. They need to basically stay alive. Well, the fact remains, the biggest threats, which is the countries around Israel, such as Egypt, Jordan, Syria, they're all fine. They've all long ago in the 70s, they were put in their place. Israel just became more and more powerful. Israel's nuclear bombs. It's never been a risk to Israel that suddenly some Jordanian is going to drive some tank across the middle,
Right.
and Israel will be cut in two. The biggest threat to Israel is the Palestinians, supposedly, because if they become too big a population, Israel loses its demographic.
Which is why they don't want to just absorb the West Bank and Gaza, which maybe they could have done, I don't know, some decade in the past. They don't want to do that because they think they'll lose the demographic war.
Exactly. So they can't become a one-state solution because then they won't be the majority. Although I believe that there's still ways in place in which a democracy can ensure that all the peoples are protected regardless of the minority. So you end up with a country that is founded on the principles of protecting Jewish ideals, even if they're a minority. You end up with a country who, if Romania starts to put Jews in concentration camps, well, this country called Israel that is mostly Palestinian, it's in its constitution to get up and fight. I don't know, something like that. Will that work? Probably not. But Jews start having their own little interests, anyway. So it's not like so clear cut regardless. The other part is the two-state solution, and Israel would just, I guess, lose a lot of land compared to what it now has and is able to do. And
well, they would have to remove their settlements, right?
They would have to stop settling. So what's next for Israel, if we kind of bring this to a close around that conversation, I believe there's a couple things. The obligation, the onus lies more on Israel than the Palestinians because A, they're the perpetrators. They started this more so than the Palestinians. And B, they're more powerful. They have all those extra resources in place to do it. Okay. And so that would require, I believe, reparations, the way Canada did, the way the United States did, to say, we are sorry for what we did. We acknowledge we did something wrong. We do have a right to exist at this point. I don't think that should be questioned. They are a country for the last 70 years. And at this point, they're as valid as any other country, which is all founded on stuff. But what are you going to do about what you've done? How are you going to clean up your act? Okay. And there's going to need to be compromises. Okay. And so A is no more settlements. This whole concept of settling more and more of Israel is so absurd. There's so much empty land in south of Israel in the desert. Okay. All of the other Middle Eastern countries have it. It happens to be that the good land, the farming land, stuff like that might be in other parts, but leave it to Israeli technology to fix that problem. And it requires negotiating with terrorists. So what Israel has been doing a lot, they love to do this, America too, is they kill the leaders at all times. So you get a leader, he rises up, he's the head of the terrorist group, Israel bombs him to oblivion. You get somebody with even less experience, Israel bombs him. And so supposedly it prevents the progression of terror realities. In reality, we see that's not the case whatsoever. Terrorists thrive just fine, maybe in a more disorganized way. And you end up with no leadership. Okay, you end up with people who have been in, Marwan Barghouti is one of the potential maybe leaders, but he's been in Israeli prison for years because he did terror attacks. But if you look at it, that's very unfortunate. I don't think there should be a politician with blood on their hands, but it's almost universal. And it's true for every single Israeli politician that ever was. They are all top military people. They've all called in airstrikes. They've all, one after the other, right? They've all done it. And so you would basically end up with a situation where I remember being revulsed by Yasser Arafat shaking hands with with Israeli Zionist leaders, but it's only because I only saw half the story. You're going to end up with a Palestinian with blood on his hands running the Palestinian territories because that's just the way these things work. And we see this globally throughout the world. There ain't no Gandhi to be negotiating with on the Palestinian side. That's the main thing I would say. I would say there's arguments around whether what's happening in Israel is a genocide or not. It seems like that mostly relates. I used to think, genocide, you have to have concentration camps, you have to be killing millions of people. Genocide is defined originally by the original inventor of the word as any time that you're just trying to move an ethnic group from erase their memory. And that could be erasing their books, erasing their culture, erasing. Israel bulldozed entire Palestinian villages, right? I owned a house on top of what was basically probably was an Arab town. The house I lived in was actually a Jewish quarter for a long time, but the neighborhood, the Western Wall, was a bunch of bulldozed buildings. They made a big, tourist attraction there. So it's full of that. There's definitely genocidal behaviors. The question is if that's the intent. And that gets very argued. Is Israel trying to destroy the Palestinians inherently or not? And that is a very subtle thing that, you can't prove one way or the other necessarily. A lot of people use the word genocide, and I think it might be quite fair to do it. Definitely everyone agrees on the term ethnic cleansing, which honestly sounds pretty bad to me. So that's where
what I would say about all these things, similar to the discussion we were having about terrorism, we need to stop focusing on the labels and understand the meaning behind the label. So if I was to say somebody is a terrorist versus a freedom fighter, I don't really care about the labels except for what we mean by them when we say them. So here's what I mean. When a lot of times when the word terrorist is thrown out, the reason that somebody's saying it is to get other people to stop thinking about why the supposed terrorist is doing what they're doing. Similarly, parents will do this with kids. Hey, my kid's doing something dumb, and this is the hidden part. Because I don't want to think about what he's doing, I'm just going to say he's stupid or he's 2 years old.
And acting out. Yeah.
Yes. So similarly, you can't just use the word terrorist in that way. You stop thinking. You stop critical thinking if you do that. Use it that way.
Exactly.
For the word genocide and for the word ethnic cleansing, I think it's the same thing. If I say something's a genocide and then that people respond to that by saying, "Oh, you're crazy because you used the word genocide," and therefore I'm going to stop thinking about what the hell you just said. That's ridiculous. So whether it is a genocide or not, fucking listen to what everyone is saying, whether they use the word genocide or some other fucking PC word.
Right.
What are other PC words they're saying, by the way?
The more political Israel?
The conflict.
Oh, the conflict. Yeah, and it's just it's a moral war. Israel is the most moral country. They just love to talk about that one. And it's just it's a self-defense, right? They're fighting a war on terror. A war on terror, that's a fun one that America has coined, right? And it's really absurd.
Yeah, war on terror without trying to dig deep and asking why are those people doing terror on us?
Right. It's this bewilderment. It's like, oh, it's because they hate us. It's a very easy conclusion to arrive at. They hate us. They're anti-Semites. They hate Jews. I was raised with all of those narratives because I was raised not just by Zionist parents, but by religious parents. And they combined, again, Zionists will do this, whatever talking point. Netanyahu doesn't believe in anything but his own ass. But when he needs to, he might invoke the Amalek, right? Suddenly this biblical people, right?
Very opportunistic.
It's very opportunistic. It's very pragmatic. And it's, I don't see, unfortunately, it is extremely powerful. People don't realize how powerful all those factors in play, right? There's Jews all over the world. Jews are in power. There's so much money. I was just reading again. They've raised close to $1 billion in private donations, some American groups, just to rebuild those territories outside Gaza that were destroyed. $1 billion
on the Israeli side only, for the Jewish
side.
side.
Of course, Israeli side. But you know what it's going to take to rebuild Gaza? It's going to take entire governments of other countries pitching in their money to do it.
We need like a Marshall Plan.
Exactly, basically. But you're not going to have. You have to have this. Okay, one final pet peeve. Okay, when there were earthquakes anywhere in the world or some national Haiti, anything like that, Israel would be the first to show up with a military convoy of like planes and like the search and rescue teams, and they would take photos and be like, look at us, no matter what conflict, what issue, humanitarian issue of the world, even people we don't get along with like Turkey, we're going to show up there and we're going to help out. Okay, that's always the picture. Well, here you have a humanitarian crisis on Israel's land with population that is the most tied to Israel's responsibility. They're not Egypt's problem. They're not Jordan's problem. There's only one people they look to for their electricity, for their water, for their currency, their banking system, their airport. Everything is tied to Israel. Okay? Israel has gone, fuck that all up, drop bombs all over it, and sits back and says, I don't know, America, I think we need more trucks here. Right? Like they caused the problem, and they're waiting for international organizations to hopefully, maybe sometimes drive humanitarian aid.
They're also blocking. I don't know if this is true, but
blocking it.
I heard they blocked that humanitarian aid from getting in.
It's completely Israel's responsibility for what happens to the civilians there as part of the occupying force, right? And take that same vibe, that same most moral army in the world there to do tikkun olam, all those talking points that Jews love to talk about, and apply it to your own backyard, the problem that you've created, and make sure that you solve the fucking problem. It is the simplest thing. And with Israeli innovation, don't be all square. Okay, that goes back to the whitewashing. I don't know, we tried, and then they massacred. Israel can invent like 6 inventions by tomorrow that prevents the people. It dispenses grain, and everybody lines up, and no one can shoot it, right? Israel could do it if they wanted to. Okay, it's not in their interest.
Especially if you consider, just between the Israel and the U.S., if all that money that we spent, and I don't mean completely dissolving our militaries, but if we toned it down by a lot, and didn't do a lot of the wars the U.S. did, and didn't do the Cold War, we would have so much money that could have been pumped into better healthcare system, helping do things that actually help the people in your own country. Because when Israel's doing the things that it's doing, spending that money on that, it's opportunity cost. You could have spent the money on helping your citizens.
100%. 50% of Israel's GDP goes to the military. And again, what threats are there against Israel from the outside? Okay, even terror.
A few of Iran's missiles.
Exactly. So deal with that. Do what you need to do. Okay, it's not soldiers. It's not foot soldiers patrolling the border with Jordan. Okay, chill out and take that money and invest it in your people and invest it in the Palestinians. Okay, and rising tide will save all ships. Unfortunately, I think things are only looking worse because what they've done, there's been now more polarization. Okay, where you have the Israelis hate the Palestinians more than ever before, and there's an active industry in Israel of, just like they had the Holocaust memorials where Jews would go and visit the camps and see, oh, this is why we need the land of Israel. Holocaust education was a huge part of
Never again.
They're doing that now also on the border with Gaza. See, this is why we can't have the Palestinians. Like, this is, we just need to defend ourselves. So it creates this very myopic.
You mean it's for the October 7th?
October 7th, yeah. So those destroyed kibbutzim that were attacked by the terrorists on October 7th are now become monuments where Jews are brought to further traumatize them into like us versus them mentality. That is part of how Israel's mechanism has been in place for years to do this, and they're just rolling with it in the next level. Meanwhile, Palestinians losing family and entire bloodlines are getting destroyed. They're not going to be so pro-Israel, despite Israel destroying all of Hamas, supposedly, right? So now you've deepened that. Now we've got Trump coming in, okay? And I don't understand the liberal people in the United States who said, oh, Biden and Kamala Harris were too pro-Israel for me, so I voted for Trump. Are you kidding me? Right? Like, do you know the difference between?
I don't pay attention that much. Okay. Are you saying Trump is more pro-Israel?
He's absolutely more pro-Israel. For example, in the last, first of all, his son-in-law is Jewish. His daughter converted to Judaism. Okay, so there's huge biases just on that level. And his son-in-law was put in charge of the Middle East negotiations. He came up with something called the Abraham Accords. And what they're doing, like Israel's biggest goal, what Israel would love is to normalize relations with other countries around it. It's already done with Egypt and Jordan. It wants to do that with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, with Qatar. And what that does is it isolates the Palestinians further. It says, look, all the Arabs are with us. Palestinians, what's your fucking problem, right? And the Palestinians,
from what I understand, during the Abraham Accords, and right before they were going to do involve Saudi Arabia in it, was the October 7th event.
Exactly. And you can understand why, because
they blew it up.
Have been abandoned by their Arab brothers since the beginning, right? Nobody stood up for them, or very weakly stood up for them. And as the years go by, the Camp David Accords in the 70s and so on and so forth, those are all each peace treaty between another country and Israel, while Israel continues to do what it does, is an abandonment of the Palestinians to their plight, right? And so they were trying to do this kick to be like, no, don't forget about us kind of thing. I'm not justifying any of the terror parts of what they did, killing civilians. But that is one of the main things that was going on there. And that's about to continue. That's not stopping.
I think there should be an Abraham Accords with Palestine in it.
Of course. So that should be a condition. And some of the Arab countries talk about it, normalizing realities with whatever. It's unclear what that even looks like. I think there's, a glimmer of hope that the world was so horrified by what Israel has done that maybe it's shaken some amount of perception. But Israel has proven themselves to be remarkably persistent in just doing whatever it wants and getting away with it. Exactly. And so I don't think it bodes well for the Palestinian situation. It doesn't help that Palestinians are generally not liberal, right? They don't have a good human rights record. They've got a lot of corruption. And that's a really complicated situation to be in. But a lot of that is also being born out of, really oppressive situations. You see, usually the more well-to-do a country is, the more liberal it becomes, the more educated it becomes. The birth rate is crazy in Palestine and Gaza, and I think that's part of it. If they had been given better education, I think you might have seen, lower birth rates and so on. So it's really a cycle that's perpetuating itself. One of the classic examples of Trump being more pro-Israel than ever before is to stay out of the really messy bit of what Jerusalem is, because Jerusalem is right there in the middle of West Bank and Palestinian and so on. Most countries have their embassies in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is not the capital of Israel, but it's the second biggest city. And they're like, okay, we're going to put our embassy here. You sort out Jerusalem and we'll show up. Trump moved it. So the symbolism of that was huge. It's Israel is recognizing Jerusalem as being only Israeli, as opposed to also Palestinian, seemingly. I mean, they could have an embassy on the other side later on if that ever becomes a thing. So it's not the end of the world. It's not like they establish it in the disputed parts of Jerusalem. But nonetheless, it was a big statement to say, oh, yeah, Jerusalem, Israel's capital. That's just it. Half of Jerusalem is all like occupied territories. That's all where I was born and where I lived was all occupied Jerusalem post 1967, which again, Israel fought this war. It claimed it was doing it in defense. I'm not even going to go whether it was or wasn't. But after that war, Israel acquired land and stayed there. So it's one thing to fight because you need to defeat an army that's out to get you. And it's another to say, well, I'm not hanging out here, right? And
yeah, I think they argued that
they needed the space.
Security. We need, a few extra yards.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot, but the land is very valuable land. It's very arid. It has a lot of farms in it. It is very farmable. There's other reasons other than security.
I mean, supposedly that's what Golan Heights was, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
To, I guess, protect itself from Syria.
Yeah. And now they've got a new buffer zone. They moved into Syria.
They went even more. Yeah.
They went even more to protect themselves even more. It's like you could always draw a new buffer zone.
Yeah, why do you need a buffer zone for a buffer zone?
Exactly, right? They're doing that in Gaza. They're doing, and that's the irony of it. Because you have a lot more space in Gaza, in the tiny enclave, the most populated place in the world. They've gone with bulldozers and created a bigger strip along the Gaza city and the border to create more of a no man's land for security reasons. Now, you could argue, why don't you just move your own cities back?
Yeah. Why did you do it on their side? Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, what is this? There's way more land in Israel. So that, again, a lot of the things that they say versus what they do are two different things, but they get away with it, right? Because the rule is, unfortunately, we've seen this, Jews experience this firsthand. Nobody cares about any other country. Nobody cares about anybody else but their own, their own ass. And that is something
maybe ideal. I keep seeing this word everywhere. There's the idealists and the pragmatists, and what you've been describing is the pragmatists. I think there are some idealists left. I think you and I are. That's what we are.
Yeah, we're idealists, but what are we doing? I mean, I'll say this. I feel an overwhelming sense of obligation to. It feels like in World War II, all the Germans are being like Nazis, and the one German who isn't, I feel like his voice is particularly important because you can have a lot of people saying it against it, but if you come from that people, so I feel like being a Jew and an Israeli and a former Zionist, if you will, I think my voice is particularly crucial. Like I have even less of a right to stay silent, or maybe an outsized impact if I speak, but I don't know what to do. I'll be perfectly honest with you. Appearing here today was part of it for me.
You gotta keep doing stuff like this.
Just say it. But what else can I do? I don't even know. Like there's an overwhelming voice. Like if you speak out, you're condemned. Again, I'm not afraid of that. You know me. And also, again, the accusation of anti-Semitism. Again, I'm not afraid of that, which is really useful, right? So most non-Jews would be afraid to speak out against Israel because, oh, you're anti-Semitic. I'm not afraid of the accusation to be anti-Semitic because I'm one of them. It's like a black person can make black jokes and Arab can make Arab jokes. So I have more immunity and therefore I think more obligation.
Well, I need to draw some of your immunity. So I got to have people like you on my show.
Exactly.
I can suck some of your immunity.
So I guess we can wrap this up with this. I can send you a whole list of links to a lot of Wikipedia and some other places for people to read more about like the history of maybe with the Jewish side of it all and the how.
Please do, and I'll include either some or all of that in the description of this video to get people to go learn more. And I think we should do more of these episodes and to talk more about what else we can do besides just podcast episodes.
Yeah, exactly. And there's another really interesting podcast. What's her name? I'll send you a link to that too. This is a woman who interviews specifically Jews who've become disenchanted. Kind of what I'm doing with my podcast for religion. She does that for you grew up Zionist and then you realize you have to stop being Zionist. What was your story? It's a fascinating world, specifically interviewing the Jews, which is really validating and really important. And she does it all in English, even though a lot of Israelis are Hebrew speakers. So I can send you that as well. There are movements, the Jewish Voices for Peace, but they're fringe. They get sidelined by a lot of the mainstream synagogues and Jewish culture as fringe, as anti-Semitic, as self-hating Jew. That's the word that we get. And so it's definitely an ongoing struggle. But I think of it like this. We can end with this. The importance, I heard this in a film recently, the importance of being on the right side of history, right? When the dust settles in 200 years and people are looking back and saying, what the fuck was going on there? I want to be the voice that says, well, I tried. I donated money. I spoke out. I did everything that I could think of doing. And it was futile, but how will I be remembered? How will the people who come after me at least remember me? I want to be on the right side of history. And that is regardless of what actually plays out. Let's be on the right side of history.
Be on the right side of history and be part of making, repairing history.
If you can. Yeah, any way that you can. To me, my agenda is more about like healing religious trauma. That is something that I've committed to. But Zionism is just another religion. Nationalism is another kind of religion. Zionism is a particularly, just like Judaism is a tenacious form of a religion that's lasted for a very long time. Zionism is tenacious, okay? Against all odds, it kind of sticks to its form. When nationalism is no longer really cool or popular, of course, unfortunately, we're seeing a resurgent trend of nationalism, but nationalism is generally, not cool, and Zionism just sticks it out. And so this concept of deconstructing Zionism, the way we deconstruct religion, is what we're here for.
Okay, well, I'm getting some ideas of what we could do next, but I don't want to make this longer. Let's talk another time. I'll email you soon. Okay, man?
Amazing.
All right.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.